Make sure to click subscribe if you enjoyed this, because part 2 will be out in a jiffy. It has been 5 months, and I vastly underestimated the amount of work that I need to put into the applications. But as penance, I have made sure to spice up this event a little bit, because that's the least I can do. So in the top right, I'm going to put the download link. So in the top right, I'm going to put the countdown until I release the download link in the comments section at the end. Pretty cool, huh? And you'll be able to chat to me as the premiere goes along, because technology.
Magic.
The final project will be open source, so you can take it apart and reverse engineer it as you like. And that's pretty much it. This is how I made Windows 95 in a PowerPoint presentation, or at least tried. Part 2 and release. Here goes. One day after release of part 1, I thought it was a good idea to improve the performance, so I tried to group everything in the window into a single shape, but of course that lost the group hierarchy and the whole thing fell apart, so I scrapped that entirely. One thing I didn't scrap though was the creation of the Notepad application. To do this, I needed to create multiple instances of Windows, so basically the way I was doing it before is I would have a single window would be called up or hidden depending on whether it's closed or open, but this time I had to create different multiple windows for the same application, which would be quite a challenge. Before I did any of that though, I made sure that the Notepad application was fully featured, and one of the main challenges was making sure that menus did not overlap with ActiveX controls when the window was open, which means you had to hid all the ActiveX controls while the menu was open. After this, I created the font settings, which would also require a few ActiveX controls, but I'd already laid down the groundwork for that, so that wasn't too complex. Then I ran into a bit of a problem. Upon the closing and opening of an app, my taskbar would completely corrupt, which is not good news. But I thought of a good idea. Instead of looping through every shape, and if it happened to be one of the taskbar items then it gets deleted, I would run through every open app and delete its corresponding taskbar item, which was much faster and actually worked. Instead of closing each window individually with its own macro, I created a universal close macro, which would first of all make things much easier to code, and second of all improve the performance vastly. Of course it had its bugs, and I had to fix those, but in the end, it worked pretty well. Finally, all that was out of the way so I could focus on the login system and the setup. I made a login macro and obviously a few error catching just in case the user entered in the wrong username, and I obviously improved the logo, which was absolutely terrible before but much more accurate this time. I made further refinements to the interface and created the final login macro. Additionally, I made a new version of the Composite Cloud Windows 95 PowerPoint background. I also, the sidebar image in the setup, I made that much closer to the actual image using shapes. It was finally time to implement window instances. It was quite a tricky thing to do. So I had to clone whatever was already there, and that was the Notepad application. But then I needed to loop through every shape and make sure each shape has a different name to another version of the window. So I had to have a macro that went through and checked how many versions of Notepad there are, and increment that and add a prefix to the start, just to make sure PowerPoint wouldn't get a bit confused. But now that I've added multiple windows, it was all working pretty well. I mean, I got up to about 3 windows, and then the biggest problem that I've ever faced during this project came up. Suddenly, out of nowhere, for some reason only on the 4th window, the whole thing would completely go corrupt. I would open a window and the badge would completely offset and the taskbar would completely obliterate, and the whole thing just came to a grinding halt, and I almost was ready to give up at this point because this is absolutely ridiculous. After a few days of absolutely cowering out, I thought I would just try and do it. So I sat down and I thought, what was the problem? I tried many different ways, and eventually I found the culprit, or sort of the culprit. It was a taskbar. It would completely just stop working, and I had no idea how to fix this, so in the end I thought I would just completely rewrite the taskbar code with the best VBA skills I could possibly conjure up to try and replace it. To solve the issue, I worked out that the taskbar code didn't really work very well, and the reason why it didn't work very well is because I was looping through multiple shapes and deleting ones willy-nilly, which doesn't work for some reason. So let me do a demonstration. So here is a grid of multiple rectangles, some of which are orange and some of which are blue. Now I'm going to write the VBA macro to loop through every single shape and delete all the orange ones. Dim shape is shape for each shape in the slide 1 shapes. If its forecolor is not this color, then it will be deleted. Let's run it. Oh, we have a little bit of a problem. You see these? Well, I mean, they aren't this colour, and they should have been deleted, but they don't get deleted, and that's exactly the problem that's happened. At the time, my programming skills weren't top-notch, so instead I just put it into an array. I put all the different names into a string, then split that into an array, and I would delete everything in that array at once. Let's see how that works. So, here we have our squares, 3, 2, 1. And you can see every single one of them disappears without fault. So this is what made my code run properly. This system was so much faster actually, it completely boosted the performance of the whole thing. So now I had a much better working system and I was ready to move on to the next thing. Amidst this mind-bending VBA shenanigans, I had the spirit now to continue on to probably one of the hardest things, but probably not the most disastrous things, which was the Windows Explorer. Naturally, I found a reference picture off the net, and I copied everything in the best way I could to try and import it into VBA PowerPoint. Now obviously I couldn't have every feature of the Windows Explorer in PowerPoint because either it would be really slow or impossible to code. So I ended up having a reasonable mix of accuracy versus usability. Unfortunately, when I imported the Windows Explorer and put it into the Windows system, there was a bit of a problem. while I could have instances of it, the resize was not very well tuned, and because my resizing system was only a single pin to either north, south, east or west, or scale or X and Y, you couldn't really have proportional scaling, which is what was needed for the two categories and contents columns. So instead I had to just keep it a fixed size, and I was pretty disappointed in that, but that's how I had to keep it. Then I began work on the desktop item dragging, which was quite hard, but it was alright. I had to arrange things into a grid, so I used modulus and rounding for that, and I also created a copy of the icon, and when you dragged the window, it would follow that and get deleted as soon as you click on the desktop again. And it ended up feeling actually quite like Windows 95, which I was quite proud of. Now this was a really hard bit. I had to add a listing for each file that was present. I had to scroll them, I had to be able to drag them and drop them into other windows, and of course I had to be able to edit, move, delete, etc. So this was quite hard. But it was working. It listed all the files and all the folders, and I added icons as well, just to add that extra bit of realism, and it was very slow. My next job was to add a navigation system. The temporary system was clicking on a folder would take you to the next directory. Of course, the next step was actually to be able to select stuff, so I created another label control that when clicked on would navigate, and when dragged would be able to move stuff. Then I worked on the dragging mechanism, so when you held down the drag, it would move according to your cursor position. A feature I wasn't really planning on adding, but actually made its way into the final build, was the ability to browse your host computer's files. I did not think about this, but when I realised I could use a file system object just to loop through every file, as if it was a file from the OS self-contained, I thought I'd just add that, and I had it read-only because I didn't want to modify your computer settings from within Windows 95 PowerPoint, because that's a bit overkill. The problem, of course, was there wasn't any scrolling mechanism, but what I did with my friend is that I just opened up System32 and watched the whole thing fall apart, which was quite funny, because there were so many different files that PowerPoint just crashed trying to add them all to the slide. So I needed to try and fix that, and then I had an idea. Well, naturally, the first step was to add a scroll bar, so I went ahead and tried and made that. Looking back a bit, the solution was pretty obvious, but it quite excited me at the time. I realised that I just needed to create two boundaries. So first, the lower boundary would be the amount that you've scrolled so far, and the upper boundary would be the amount you've scrolled so far plus the amount that you could have displayed at once on the screen. And literally, you just loop through every file and only display those that fall between those two boundaries. So I give every single item an ID, and if that ID is between those two, then display it. And that got rid of the issue almost entirely. But to solve the problem of the slowness, I don't think I have any footage of this. I couldn't find any footage of this. But what I did, I replaced all the icons with images, so that instead of having multiple shapes that PowerPoint has to think about and render, just a single shape with the image fill, which ended up working much faster. Additionally, this thing that you're watching right now is I created a dialog just in case you opened up the E drive or the drive with the DVD in without a DVD in, because that would throw up an error, and I just created a custom error to catch that. And I also created a custom dialog for opening up a file from the external drive, which obviously it may not be able to read every single file and put it into Notepad, so I created a custom dialog to ask the user if they really wanted to do that. First of all, it was time to try and brave the file dragging. My first attempt was when you hovered over or on the mouse over event, while you were dragging, it would set that to the destination. But unfortunately, for some reason, while you're dragging something, the mouse over event doesn't actually fire, which was really disappointing, so I'd have to think of something else. For my solution to work, it would have to know which shape is being hovered over. To do this, I would loop through every shape. I know it sounds slow, but it actually worked. And if, first of all, the cursor position fell between the boundaries of the shape, and the shape was visible, and the last shape to fit that description would be the shape that is being hovered over. So I use that to work out where the user is pointing and therefore where they want to drop their file. Of course, that meant moving both files and folders, so I had to write a macro that would be able to rename every single shape that belonged to that folder with a new directory, and that was quite a challenge trying to get that right. But that was quite fun, because I'd have folders that would create folders inside folders with the same name, and move the folder inside a new folder with the same name, and do all this kind of weird stuff. Then I created the moving folders animation. That was quite funny, because I spent all that time trying to perfect it. I had the page moving between the two folders in an animation I just looped, but then when it came to the actual number crunching, PowerPoint didn't want to render the animation, so it just looked completely static. It was still quite fun, and even though it took a while, it only took a few milliseconds to move the folders, because literally it's just renaming shapes, it still was, it was up there for long enough to actually, you could see the folder, so it wasn't a total disaster. Somewhere in the midst of all this, I needed to create a calendar. So if you click on the furthest right hand part of the taskbar in actual Windows 95, you get this little dialog that shows you the calendar and also the time. First of all, I created the calendar. Now this was quite hard. I used a table to create the table, and the headers would be the top row would be the headers, and the rest of it would be the days. Second of all, I needed to lay out the numbers so that they would flow from one bit to the other with an offset. That was quite tricky. Once I got that right, I needed to then be able to render each different day in the correct order and depending on the month. So first of all, I looked online for a function that would tell you which years were leap years, and I found one on Stack Overflow that was pretty simple. Just a little bit of modulus. The second thing I needed to look up was just which months had a certain amount of days, which wasn't too hard. And then I challenged myself to create the rest of my function alone, which I probably wasted a few hours doing, but it was probably worth it in the end. For For the clock face though, that was much more simple. It's pretty much a case of just translating it into 360 degrees. But then, of course, I couldn't have that running on in the background because that would be very resource intensive. So instead, I just had it when you clicked the refresh button, it would update everything. That's the best I could do really, otherwise the whole thing would go very, very slowly. Now, I would consider this probably the point where all the groundwork had almost been finished, and this is a transition point between that and starting to work on the applications the most. So, sure, I did have applications, but this is a point where I started to add tabs, and this is the last feature that I needed in the Windows system. So, for example, if you had an application and instead of opening up another whole dialog, you just want to stay in the same application but do something else. This enables you to have side panes and different sections of your application and allowed more complex applications to be developed. And simply, I would just have, for each window, there would be the current selected pane, and I would just hide all the shapes that are not in that pane and ignore all the shapes that don't apply to this tabs business and show all the shapes that are on the current pane.
You said that sentence got away from you?
It got away from me, yeah.
And everything was pretty much set in terms of the Windows system. With all that out of the way, it was time to create these save and open dialogs. Quite by chance, almost completely accidentally, I managed to simplify the process completely. Instead of having to rewrite everything in the Windows Explorer code, it was universal, so it could work with any named application, which was perfect. Now, I did get slightly carried away with this and it ended up creating a bug, but I fixed that in one of my other videos, which I put in the description, and well, you can see my problem solving process on a more down-to-earth level. Something that wasn't so accidental, however, was my foresight into the fact that I could literally just reuse the dialogs. So instead, because I was splitting the macro into two parts, I could just, if I wanted to use this, for example, orbit documents, I would create a different macro for the save dialog and then just change the dialog button to run that macro instead. Probably the hardest application to create was orbit documents. It's not really that hard because it was difficult, it was just because there was so much content. As a safety net, I'd been working on it on a separate slide, so when I put it into the actual main slide, I forgot that I renamed two things the same thing, so I had to correct that. But afterwards, my basic UI design had been completed. So now it was obviously time to complete everything. I don't have much footage of this because I did it mostly at my grandmother's place with my terrible laptop, but I can show you a few clips from it. Additionally, I prefer it that way since there are a lot of features I'd rather the user discovers when they actually download Windows 95 PowerPoint. One problem I did face though was the colour picker dialog. I found a multiplier between the percentage of how far the picker is along the colour gradient and how far up it is for the saturation, and used that as a multiplier for 360 and 1 respectively. But the problem was I didn't know how to convert HSL to RGB, so I found this really helpful macro or function. It was from Excel Off the Grid, which had very helpful library, and it was the only code that I've needed to borrow so far in this project, so I do thank them. Next up, the calculator. Though it took me almost 2 hours, it probably wasn't the most difficult to create. In fact, it was very straightforward. The only problems that I ran into was the subtraction, where I got the two subtracting bits the wrong way around, and the add when they concatenated the string instead of added the numbers, but all I needed to do was cast them into doubles. Then I set out to create the icons and design of the control panel. Because I was designing all the icons from scratch with multiple shapes for each one, I thought it would slow down the whole loading of the code and everything, but actually it didn't, which was quite fortunate. Just like before, I literally just copied another one of those tabs and used that for the accessibility options. I was a bit stuck on what to do for that, but then I realised you can have dyslexia-friendly fonts, and you can also change the colour scheme to be more high contrast as well, so I thought I would add those options. I didn't code them immediately because I wanted to add them later and just get all the dialogues out of the way and done with. Next, I worked on the Internet Explorer setup. Now, web browsers in PowerPoint rely on something called the web browser control, which is an ActiveX control, and unfortunately Microsoft disabled that for every computer that's running Office 2013 and onwards, because it's a great big security concern because it runs IE4, which is not the safest way to browse the web these days, but luckily Zulo had a solution. You can go and replace IE4 with IE11 with a registry key called browser emulation, and in doing so you then override pretty much the security concern so long as Microsoft continues to work on Internet Explorer. And so I had to obviously create a setup that would detect whether your computer has already enabled it or not, and allow the user to follow the instructions to change the registry keys, and then launch Internet Explorer. Then I came across a thumping great big problem, and I almost quit making IE and almost didn't include it because of this. It was because as soon as you move the web browser control, the entire page gets unloaded and you have to load it again. So if you're filling in the form and then you want to switch to Notepad to write something down, or if you're doing research from the net, as soon as you switch windows, the entire thing will break. And the same happens with refreshing the slide, which the whole code relied on refreshing the slide all the time to make sure the whole thing doesn't break, which means I had a bit of an issue. But I couldn't solve that, so I guess people just have to deal with that, I'm sorry. However, I needed to detect whether the user actually had the control enabled or not. If you didn't have it enabled, then you get a syntax error, or a compile error, sorry, because when you're referencing your control, it doesn't exist according to PowerPoint, and unfortunately you can't catch compile errors in VBA, which is really irritating, which means that the whole thing will just break, even when you're selecting the window. However, I came up with a crafty solution. I used .oleobject. Which would access the object's properties indirectly using the shape object rather than directly referencing them, which means you can't do a compile error because it wouldn't know if it's incompatible or not because you're referencing it by name, which means that I managed to catch the error and the whole thing works, luckily. What a mouthful. Next, I worked on Paint, which was a very, very exhausting application to create, and I didn't know how to approach this problem. So, first of all, I just made the interface and experimented a little. My first idea was to have just samples and dot them everywhere, just like a continuous stream of particles, but that made it really laggy. So instead I opted for a different method where I would create a polygon and I'd make a big long tube, and whenever you move your cursor position it would add another point on the vector. So you create a continuous line, which is actually how I did things in the end, and it worked really well. And for the other tools, it was pretty much the same technique. I just used, instead of a custom wiggly polygon, I used, for example, a square. or rectangle even. And for the different brushes, I just varied the look and feel of the effects on the polygon. For the deletion or the rubber, I instead opted to, instead of overwriting it with white like Paint actually does, I thought it would be easier to just straight up delete the item that corresponds to its position. So it isn't exactly the same as Paint, and I was a bit disappointed with myself that I couldn't get off the ground. But remember, this is completely PowerPoint, and not everything could be exactly the replica of the operating system version. If I had stuck to and been faithful to the actual program, I would have had to keep reinserting the image over and over again, and that would have been much trickier and actually rather counterintuitive as well. Unless I'm gravely mistaken, I don't think Windows Update, especially not as we know it today, was a thing in Windows 95. But I added it to Windows 95 PowerPoint because I needed some way of adding features later on once a user had downloaded Windows 95 PowerPoint without having to go and copy their files and all this stuff. They wanted to preserve their files while getting a new version. I was going to give up because hosting. I mean, am I just going to host a server just for this? No, I'm not. And learn all the server-side stuff. And then, I thought, and I came up with quite a crafty solution, that I could use Google Drive to do all this. Now, how was I going to do this? Well, I couldn't use a browser because you could have a different default browser. IE didn't work, Internet Explorer. So I spent hours on Stack Overflow, and then I found URL download to file to download files from a direct download link. I didn't use OneDrive because you couldn't get direct download links very easily, but Google Drive, you just have to change the URL a bit. And this was a breakthrough for me. But that was only the beginning, because first of all, you need to know when to download the new version. That's only if your version number is less than the current version number. So every time you logged in, I came up with a crafty solution. I would screen scrape, and literally from the Google Drive folder view, I would literally cut out the version number between two underscores from the name of the text file, and then compare it, and if so, then it will prompt you to download. Secondly, the download link changes, right, because you're uploading a new file. So I stored that inside that other text file. Then I needed to download that text file and extract the link, and then use URL download to file. And once I've done that, there was obviously the problem of copying the shapes across. Only shapes that weren't already present had to be copied across, just in case that you have program files in the new version that weren't in the old version. If you just copied all the files from the old version into the new version and deleted the original files in the new version, then it wouldn't work. And after all that, bam! Windows Update. It's time for the evaluation of PowerPoint Windows 95. Let's start with the negatives. I mean, have a look at this speed. I wouldn't exactly call it speed, I'd call it unspeed. Apart from being quite slow, it's at times, especially with certain applications for some reason, really buggy. I mean, if you've actually seen Windows or used Windows 95, you'll know that this is completely different. I mean, it looks and feels similar, but it isn't Windows 95, and there are a lot of visual differences, especially in the taskbar. There's also a notable lack of the right-click function. Despite this, and taking into account that it's a literal PowerPoint presentation, I mean, it's a goofy idea for sure, and I don't know why I'm seriously evaluating this project, but it has turned out quite well. Aside from its negative points, you can do quite a lot in it, and in fact, you could even use it for some of your daily life tasks, and you could go with it for about an hour, maybe, and still find things to explore with, so it's not all doom and gloom. Now, let's take a look at the statistics. The whole thing is just under 6,000 lines of code. That could be good or it could be bad, depending on what your point of view is. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh on myself, but I think not. I could have done better if I'd given myself more time. It's just because I severely underestimated the amount of work that I need to put into this. This is only a 5-month project. If I'd given myself a year, maybe a year and a half, I could have got quite close to emulating Windows 95, because it's possible to do the things I left out. However, I'm going to be taking time in my next project, my next shot at this with Windows 7, to make it much, much better, and closer to Windows 7 as I can, if I manage. Now, if you want to see me doing these projects, of course you can subscribe, have a look at the Discord server or the subreddit. I'll put these links in the description. Self-promotion aside, we're just going to take a little time to have a little time-lapse of all the different features in Windows 95 PowerPoint before the download at the end of the video. Here goes. Thank you all for watching and have a brilliant new year. And I'll see you in the next one, where we trash Windows 95. Over and out.